Story number 1. Footsteps in the attic. I should have known better than to spend Christmas Eve alone in that house. The signs had always been there. Subtle whispers of unease that crept into my bones whenever I stepped inside. But I told myself it was just nostalgia. The kind that clings to you when you're surrounded by the echoes of a life you no longer live. The house had been in my family for generations. An old Victorian relic tucked into a quiet corner of Chicago. Its creaky floors and drafty windows had once been home to laughter, bustling holiday gatherings, and the comforting scent of roasted turkey wafting through the air. But that was years ago. By 1993, the house stood empty, a hollow shell of memories and dust. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Spend Christmas Eve reconnecting with the past, soaking in the quiet solitude of the house I'd grown up in. My family was scattered now, living their own lives in different states, and I wasn't particularly close to any of them. So, with a bottle of red wine, a stack of old VHS tapes, and a blanket draped over my shoulders, I settled into the living room, ready to reminisce. The first few hours passed uneventfully. The house was as I remembered it, dimly lit, with shadows stretching long across the walls, the kind of quiet that seemed alive in its stillness. I watched old holiday specials on the small, boxy television I dug out from the storage closet. The wind howled faintly outside, rattling the ancient windows, but inside, the house was warm, until I heard the first creak. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft groan from the ceiling above me. I glanced up, heart skipping a beat, but quickly dismissed it. The house was old houses made noises. I turned back to the television, laughing at myself for being so jumpy. But then it happened again, this time louder, more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. I muted the TV, my ears straining against the silence. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, the distinct creak of wood bending under weight. Someone or something was moving in the attic. I tried to rationalize it. Squirrels, maybe, or a raccoon. Chicago was full of them. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way toward the narrow staircase that led up to the attic. The steps groaned beneath my weight as I climbed, my breath puffing out in little clouds in the chill air. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. The silence pressed against my ears, so thick it was almost deafening. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The attic was just as I remembered it, cluttered with old furniture draped in dusty sheets, stacks of yellowing newspapers, and boxes of forgotten keepsakes. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the room in fragments. Nothing seemed out of place, but as I turned to leave, the beam caught something. A pile of boxes near the far corner had been toppled over, their contents spilling out onto the floor. I knew I hadn't touched them. I straightened the boxes as best I could, trying to ignore the crawling sensation on the back of my neck. As I turned to leave, I froze. The flashlight caught a faint smudge on the dusty floorboards. A footprint, barefoot, too small to be mine. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I backed out of the attic, my pulse thundering in my ears. I shut the door behind me and hurried down the stairs, my mind racing. The house was empty. It had to be. But as I reached the living room, I saw it. The mirror, the large, antique mirror that hung above the fireplace had always been there, a relic of my grandmother's decorating sense. But now, it bore something new. A message, scrawled in uneven, jagged letters across its surface. "Merry Christmas." The words were smeared into the foggy surface of the glass, as if traced by a finger. My stomach turned to ice. I hadn't been near the mirror all night. No one else was in the house. At least, no one I could see. I stood frozen, staring at the words, my breath fogging up the glass. Then, from the attic, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Only now, they weren't soft. They were heavy, slow, and they were coming down the stairs. I didn't wait to find out what was making them. Grabbing my coat and keys, I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks in my panic. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could swear they were right behind me. I didn't dare look back. Finally, the lock clicked, and I flung the door open, stumbling out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. From the safety of the driver's seat, I glanced back at the house. The attic window glowed faintly, pale light flickering inside, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me. I never went back to that house. The next morning, I called a locksmith to change the locks, but I never stepped foot inside again. Still standing, as far as I know, empty and waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the message on the mirror, the bare footprints in the attic, and the heavy footsteps following me down the stairs. Who or what was in that house with me that night? I don't know, and I never want to find out. Story number 2. The shadow beneath the tree. I've always considered myself a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, they all seemed like elaborate stories to me. The kind of thing you tell kids to keep them entertained on dark, stormy nights. But that Christmas Eve in 2007 changed my perspective forever. I still don't have a rational explanation for what happened. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. My name is Amy, and back then, I was just another college student trying to juggle school, part-time work, and a social life. That year, I made the bold decision to stay on campus for Christmas break. My roommates had all gone home, and I thought I'd enjoy a few quiet days alone to catch up on a major research project. My little off-campus apartment wasn't much, but it was cozy. I'd even gone to the trouble of decorating a tiny artificial Christmas tree, some fairy lights around the windows, and a few festive knickknacks scattered around. Felt nice, peaceful, even, at least. First, the evening started out as planned. I had a pot of coffee brewing, my laptop open, and a stack of notes spread out on the table. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the heater. Outside, the snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes, muffling the sounds of the world. It should have been the perfect atmosphere for productivity. But as the hours ticked by, a strange sense of unease crept over me. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a faint, nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. First, I blamed it on the solitude. I wasn't used to being entirely by myself in the apartment, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced toward the Christmas tree in the corner of the room. Its tiny LED lights casting soft glows of red, green, and gold across the walls. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then I caught it, a flicker of movement in the reflection of one of the glass ornaments. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It had been so quick. I couldn't even be sure what I'd seen. A shadow, maybe, something darting across the room? I laughed nervously at myself, shaking my head. Get a grip, Amy, I muttered. You've been watching too many horror movies. I tried to refocus on my work, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every so often, I'd glance at the tree, half expecting to see something lurking there. By midnight, the apartment had grown colder despite the heater still running, and the silence felt oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Then it happened again. I'd leaned back in my chair to stretch, my eyes landing on the Christmas tree. For a split second, I saw it, a dark shape in the reflection of one of the ornaments. It wasn't my own reflection, either. It was smaller, distorted, like the outline of a crouched figure. This time, I didn't dismiss it. My instincts screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the tree. The tiny lights seemed to shimmer and flicker in an unnatural way, and the longer I stared, the more I felt like something was staring back. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt like jelly as I crossed the room and flipped the light switch, plunging the apartment into darkness. The only illumination came from the tiny, blinking lights of the tree. I stood there, holding my breath, straining to hear any sound beyond the pounding of my own heart. After a few moments, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out and yanked the plug from the wall, cutting off the tree lights and leaving the room in total darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around me. Every light in the apartment turned on, clutching my phone in case I needed to call someone. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just overtired and letting my imagination run wild. But the next morning proved me wrong. When daylight finally came, I gathered the courage to inspect the tree. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The ornaments and lights were all there, though the faint memory of that shadow still lingered in my mind. But then I noticed one of the glass ornaments lying shattered beneath the tree. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. And it wasn't just broken. It was cracked in a way that didn't make sense, as if something had deliberately pressed against it from the inside. Then I saw the other decorations. Several ornaments had been moved, shifted to different branches. A tiny angel figurine that had been at the top of the tree was now sitting on one of the lower branches. His porcelain face turned toward me. I didn't wait to figure out what it all meant. I packed a bag and left the apartment within the hour, spending the rest of the holiday with a friend in town. When I returned a few days later, nothing else had been disturbed, but I never plugged that tree in again. To this day, I still don't know what happened that Christmas Eve. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was all just a series of coincidences, a draft, a trick of the light, maybe even my own clumsiness. But deep down, I know better. Something was there that night, something that watched me from the shadows and left its mark on my tree. And every Christmas since then, when I see those twinkling lights and sparkling ornaments, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to notice, or worse, waiting for me to invite it back. Story number 3. The knocking in the night. I remember that Christmas Eve vividly, even though nearly 4 decades have passed since that night. The details remain etched in my memory like frost on a window pane, impossible to forget no matter how much time has tried to dull the edges. My name is Linda, and this is a story I rarely share, partly because I fear the judgment of others, but mostly because every time I speak it aloud, it feels as if I'm summoning it back into my life. It was December 24th, 1985, and I had opted to spend the holiday alone. My family lived across the state, and while I usually made the trip, that year I decided to stay home. I had a cozy little house nestled on the outskirts of a quiet Pennsylvania town, the kind of place where the woods crept up to your backyard and the nearest neighbor was a half-mile away. I'd planned the perfect evening, no obligations, no visitors, just me, a warm fire, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read. Snow had been falling steadily all evening, blanketing the yard and turning the world outside into a picturesque postcard. It was peaceful, or at least, it should have been. Around 11:30 p.m., I was curled up in my favorite armchair by the fireplace, lost in the pages of a novel, when I heard it for the first time. Knock, knock. The sound was faint, so soft I almost dismissed it as the house settling or the wind rustling the trees outside. But then it came again, a little louder this time. Knock, knock. I set my book down and glanced at the front door, visible from where I sat. The porch light illuminated the yard beyond, casting long shadows over the pristine snow. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the late hour made me hesitate. Who would be out here in this weather? Probably just a neighbor, I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I got up and walked to the door, my heart beating a little faster than it should have been. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but snow drifting lazily under the yellow glow of the porch light. No one was there. I unlocked the door and opened it cautiously, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I peered outside. The porch was empty. The snow was undisturbed, not a single footprint marring its surface. The wind howled softly through the trees, but otherwise, The night was silent. "Hello," I called. My voice barely above a whisper. Felt silly, standing there in my slippers and robe, talking to the empty darkness. But no one answered. I shut the door, locked it, and returned to my chair, convincing myself it had been my imagination. About 20 minutes later, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. "Knock, knock, knock." I froze, gripping the armrests of my chair. My eyes darted to the door, and a chill ran down my spine. The sound hadn't come from the front door this time. It had come from the back. The kitchen door. I stood slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. The kitchen door led out to the backyard, which bordered the woods. I hadn't turned on the back porch light, so the glass panes in the door were nothing more than black mirrors, reflecting the dim interior of my house. "Knock, knock, knock," came again, sharper this time, as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted to make sure I heard it. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The only response was the low moan of the wind outside, summoning every ounce of courage I had. I walked to the kitchen and flipped on the porch light. The bulb flickered once before casting a weak glow over the snow-covered yard. And there they were, footprints, large, heavy prints leading up to the door and stopping abruptly at the threshold. They hadn't been there earlier. Of that I was certain. My stomach churned as I realized the pattern in the snow didn't look quite human. The prints were long and narrow, with sharp indentations where toes should have been, almost like claws. I backed away from the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The knocking stopped, replaced by a new sound, a faint, scratching noise, as if something was dragging its nails along the other side of the door. I turned off the light and stumbled back into the living room, heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair, wrapped in a blanket, my eyes fixed on the front and back doors. The knocking didn't return, but the house was far from silent. Every so often, I heard faint creaks and groans, as if someone or something was walking along the porch, circling the house. By the time dawn broke, my nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. I forced myself to get up and check the yard, hoping daylight would bring clarity, or at least a sense of safety. What I found only deepened my terror. The footprints were everywhere. They circled the house in a chaotic pattern, overlapping and crisscrossing as if whatever had made them had spent the entire night pacing around my home. Worse, the snow was disturbed beneath every window, as though it or they had been standing there, watching me. I didn't stay to figure out what had happened. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove to a friend's house in town. I stayed there for the rest of the holidays, too afraid to go back. To this day, I don't know what knocked on my door that night. I moved out of that house the following spring and never looked back. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the wind howls outside and the shadows stretch long, I think about the knocking, about the footprints, about the thing that watched me through the windows, and I wonder if it's still out there, wandering the woods, looking for another house, another door to knock on.